She didn't say hello. That was the first thing I noticed. My daughter-in-law called me on a Tuesday morning in October, and the first words out of her mouth were, "Did you get the paperwork I emailed?" Not good morning. Not how are you feeling, Dad, just the paperwork. I told her I had. I was sitting at my kitchen table at the time, the same table where I'd eaten breakfast for 31 years, the window behind me catching the last of the season's light. The oak out back had turned fully orange. I remember thinking it looked like it was on fire. "Good," she said. "The contractor needs the second draw by Friday." I said I'd take care of it. She hung up before I finished the sentence. I sat there for a moment with the phone in my hand and the oak tree burning outside and something sitting in my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. My name is Arthur. I'm 68 years old. I spent 32 years as a structural engineer before I retired, and I have always believed that the bones of a thing matter more than the surface. I have built my life around that idea. So when my son came to me 3 years ago with a plan to open a specialty coffee roastery and cafe, a real one, not a hobby, a business with a lease and equipment and a roasting room and a tasting bar, I didn't dismiss it. I listened. I looked at the numbers. I looked at the location he'd chosen, a corner unit in a neighborhood that was still becoming something. I looked at my son's face, which is a face I have known since the moment it existed in the world, and I believed him. My son's name is Brendan. He is 37. He has his mother's eyes and my stubbornness. And when he wants something, he goes after it with a kind of quiet intensity that I have always admired. He married Courtney 9 years ago. She is smart and organized, and has a way of taking up space in a room that I used to mistake for confidence. Brendan had been working for a regional coffee distributor for 6 years when he told me about the roastery. He knew the industry. He had relationships with suppliers. He had a business plan that was 42 pages long, and he had walked me through every section of it at this same kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon in March. And by the time he finished, I was convinced. I invested $310,000. That is not a number. I say lightly. That was the money from my mother's estate, what remained of my own retirement contributions beyond what I needed to live, and the equity I pulled from a rental property I'd held for 18 years. I liquidated things I had spent decades building. I did it without hesitation because I believed in my son, and because his mother, my wife Patricia, had died 4 years earlier of a stroke at 61, and one of the last things she ever said to me was that Brendan was going to do something that mattered. I wanted to honor that. I wanted to be part of something that mattered. We did not sign a formal loan agreement. I want to be honest about that. I have thought about it 1,000 times since, and I want to be honest. Brendan mentioned early on that he could draw up paperwork, some kind of promissory note, and I waved it off. I said it wasn't necessary. I said we were family. I said I trusted him completely, and I did, and that trust was not misplaced in Brendan. That part I still believe. What I did not account for was Courtney. The construction took 8 months. I got regular updates in the beginning. Photos of the space being gutted, the roasting equipment arriving on a flatbed, the bar being built from reclaimed wood that Brendan had sourced himself. I got text messages with pictures. I got phone calls on Sunday evenings. For the first 5 months, I felt included. I felt like a partner. Then the updates slowed. I noticed it gradually. A week would pass without a photo. I'd send a message asking how things were going and get back a short reply, usually from Courtney. Coming along. Brendan's slammed right now. I'd call Brendan directly, and more often than not, it would go to voicemail. He'd call back eventually, but the conversations got shorter. He seemed distracted. I told myself he was busy, which was true. Opening a business is an all-consuming thing. I knew that. I gave him room. What I did not know was that the roastery had opened. I found out the way you find out things you were never meant to find out. My neighbor's daughter, a young woman named Petra, who I have known since she was in grade school, mentioned it in passing one Saturday morning when I was getting my mail. She said, "Mr. Burr, Arthur, I heard Brendan's coffee place opened up. I saw it on Instagram. It looks beautiful." She said it the way you say something you assume the other person already knows. I stood at my mailbox in the November cold and kept my face very still. "Thank you," I said. "It does look beautiful." I went inside and sat down at the kitchen table, and I looked up the roastery on Instagram. It had been open for 7 weeks. There were photos from the opening day, balloons on the door, a crowd inside, Brendan and Courtney cutting a ribbon, Brendan laughing with what looked like 50 people around him. The comments were full of congratulations. The most recent post had 143 likes. I was not in a single photograph. I sat with that for a long time. I'm not sure how long. The light changed in the kitchen. I made a cup of coffee, which felt like the wrong thing to do, and also the only thing to do. I looked at the photographs again. I looked at my son's face, which was open and happy in a way I had not seen in years, and I was glad he was happy, and I was something else at the same time that I didn't want to look at directly. I called him that afternoon. He answered on the third ring, which surprised me. "Hey, Dad." "Hey." I paused. I heard the roastery opened. There was a beat of silence that lasted a half-second longer than it should have. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, we soft opened a few weeks ago. It's been going really well." 7 weeks ago, I said. Another pause. "Around then, yeah." "Brendan." I kept my voice level. I have always kept my voice level. It is one of the things I am most deliberate about. Why didn't you tell me? What he said next is something I have turned over many times since. He said, "Courtney thought it would be better to wait until we were fully up and running before doing a bigger celebration. She wanted everything to be perfect before we made a big deal of it." I asked if a bigger celebration was being planned. He said he thought so. He said he'd have to check with Courtney. He said he had to go. That service was starting, and he said he'd call me that weekend. And I said okay, and we hung up. And he did not call that weekend. I let 10 days pass. I have never been someone who chases people down. I have always believed that if someone wants to speak to you, they will. That if you matter to someone, they make room for you. I held that belief for 10 days, and then I let it go, and I called again. Courtney answered. "Arthur," she said in the tone she used when she was managing something. I told her I was calling to check in on the business. I asked how the opening had gone. I asked, and I chose the words carefully, whether there were any plans for a family gathering at the Roastery, since I hadn't had a chance to see the space yet. She said the opening had been small. She said they'd kept it to close family and a few friends from the industry. I said, "I understand. I'm just looking forward to seeing it." She said, "Of course, we'll definitely have you out soon." Then she said, "Actually, since I have you, the second quarter equipment payment came in higher than projected. We're looking at about a $40,000 gap. Brendan and I were hoping you might be able to help bridge it." I did not say anything for a moment. She continued. She said the roasting drum had needed an upgraded part that wasn't in the original quote, and there had been some permitting delays that extended their pre-revenue period, and that they were cash flow positive now, but the timing of the payment was difficult. I said I would think about it. She said she appreciated that, and that she'd send over the details. I got off the phone and I sat in the same chair at the same table, and I thought about my wife. I thought about what she would have said if she'd been sitting across from me. Patricia had a way of seeing to the center of things. She would have looked at me and she would have said, "Arthur, don't let love make you foolish." And then she would have said, "But don't let fear make you cold either." She always held both things at the same time. That was one of the things I missed most about her. I thought about what I was feeling, not what I should feel, what I actually felt. I sat with it honestly. I felt like I had paid for a door that I was not allowed to walk through. The next week, I drove to the Roastery. I did not tell Brendan or Courtney I was coming. I drove 40 minutes down Route 9 and took the exit into the neighborhood Brendan had chosen, which was exactly what he'd said it would be. A block of older buildings going through their second life, a bookshop on one corner, a plant store on another, scaffolding on the building across the street. The Roastery was on the ground floor of a 3-story brick building. The signage was in a clean serif font, dark green letters on cream. There were 2 large windows along the front, and through them I could see people at tables, a long bar along the interior wall, pendant lights, the copper roasting drum visible through a glass partition in the back. It was beautiful. My son had built something genuinely beautiful. I stood on the sidewalk for several minutes. I did not go inside. I told myself I wasn't ready. That was the truth as far as I could tell. I wasn't ready to walk in there and be just another customer in something I had made possible. I wasn't ready to watch my son greet me with surprise because he hadn't known I was coming and hadn't thought to bring me there himself. I wasn't ready to shake hands with strangers over espresso in a room I had paid for, in which my name appeared nowhere. I got back in my car and I drove home. That night I pulled out every document I had from the investment. the emails in which the amounts were discussed, the wire transfer records, a spreadsheet I had kept tracking each disbursement: $80,000 in January, $75,000 in March, $60,000 in March, $60,000 in March, $55,000 in August, $40,000 in September. Total $310,000 across 5 transfers over 9 months. I went through each one carefully, and then I noticed something I had not noticed before, or perhaps had not looked for before. There was a transfer in the September batch that did not match any of the invoices Courtney had sent me. The roasting equipment invoice was $38,400. The wire I had sent was $40,000. I had assumed the difference, $1,600, was a rounding or a miscellaneous expense. I had not examined it closely. I examined it closely now. I went back through the earlier transfers. There were similar discrepancies in 2 of the other batches. Small amounts, $20,200 here, $1,800 there, that I could not match to any supporting invoice. In isolation, they looked like rounding errors. Added together, they came to $27,400. Then I found the transfer I could not explain at all. In the August batch, there was a $40,000 wire I had sent in 2 parts on Courtney's instructions. She had told me the equipment vendor required separate payments for compliance reasons, which I had not questioned. I found the invoice for 1 part. The second part, $18,500, had no corresponding invoice anywhere in my records. I called my accountant the next morning. His name is Walter, and I know there is a Walter in the file of names I should not use, so I will simply call him my accountant, and I have worked with him for 20 years. I told him what I had found, and I asked him to look at it with me. We spent 90 minutes on the phone. By the end of it, he said quietly and carefully, "Arthur, you need to talk to a lawyer before you do anything else." I called a lawyer that afternoon, a woman I was referred to who handles civil litigation and family business disputes. She listened to everything I told her, and she asked me to bring in all the documentation, and when I did, she reviewed it and confirmed what my accountant had suspected. Approximately $46,000 could not be traced to any legitimate business expense. She explained my options. She said that because there was no formal loan agreement, the legal path was not simple, but it was not impossible. The wire transfers and the documented communication established the nature of the investment clearly enough. She said she had seen this situation before, more often than I might expect, and almost always within families. She said the first step was to request a full accounting from Brendan and Courtney directly, in writing, before taking any legal action. I thanked her. I drove home. I sat at the kitchen table as the last of the November light went out of the yard, and I wrote my son a letter. Not an email. A letter. On paper by hand, in the careful block print I learned as an engineer. 4 pages. I told him about the discrepancies I had found. I told him about the amounts. I told him about the invoice that did not exist. I told him I was not asking him to explain Courtney's actions to me. I had already drawn my own conclusions about whose hands had been on the accounts. I told him I was asking him to look at what I had laid out and to tell me, honestly, what he knew. I told him I was not angry with him. That was the hardest line to write, and it was true. I told him I was sad. I told him that I had given what I gave because I believed in him, because his mother had believed in him, and because I had wanted to be part of something he built. I told him I had not expected to be paid back in full. I had always understood this investment might not return a dollar, but I had expected to be treated as though I mattered to the people I loved. I told him I had learned instead that his wife had called me not to tell me the business had opened, not to thank me, not to invite me to see what my money had made possible, but to ask me for more of it. I told him that on the day I drove to the roastery and stood on the sidewalk outside, I had looked through the window at the copper drum and the pendant lights and the room full of people, and I had felt something that took me a while to identify. I told him I had felt like a stranger at something I had built. I sealed the letter. I mailed it to his home address, not the roastery. And then I waited. He called me 11 days later. I knew from the way the phone rang, which makes no sense, I know. A phone rings the same way every time, but I knew. I picked up, and he said, "Dad," and I could tell from that one word that he had read every page. "I know," he said. Then, after a long silence, "I didn't know about all of it." I believed him. I still believe him. Not because I am naive. I have been an engineer for 32 years and I do not mistake assumptions for load-bearing facts, but because I know my son's voice the way I know the sound of that house, and what I heard in it was not guilt. It was grief. He told me he had known about one of the smaller discrepancies. He said Courtney had told him it was a bookkeeping reclassification. He said he had not pressed her on it because things had been difficult between them at the time, and he had chosen not to fight that particular battle. He said he had not known about the $18,500, and that when he confronted Courtney with my letter, she had told him it had gone to pay off a personal credit card balance she had run up before they opened, and that she had planned to reimburse it from her salary once the business was profitable. She had not told Brendan. She had not told me. She had not told me. She had moved the money and said nothing, and then called me a month later to ask for $40,000 more. There was a long silence on the phone. Long enough that I got up from the table and stood at the kitchen window, looking at the oak tree that was bare now, all its fire spent. I could see the shape of it clearly against the gray sky. That is the thing about winter. You can see the bones. I'm sorry, Dad, Brendan said. I know you are, I said. What do you want to do? I had thought about that question for 11 days. I had thought about it at 3 in the morning when I couldn't sleep, and in the middle of the afternoon when I was trying to read and while I was standing on that sidewalk looking through the glass at a room I had never entered. I had thought about what Patricia would have wanted. I had thought about what I could live with and what I could not. I told Brendan that I was not going to pursue legal action as long as certain things happened. I told him I wanted a formal loan agreement drawn up, retroactive, documenting the full $300,000. I wanted a repayment schedule attached to it, realistic, structured around the business's actual cash flow. I wanted to be listed as a silent partner with the right to review quarterly financials. And I told him that I wanted Courtney to acknowledge in writing, to me directly, what she had done with the $46,000. And I wanted a personal repayment plan from her for that amount specifically, separate from the business loan. I told him I did not want an apology from Courtney. I had learned that an apology from someone who does not yet understand what they did is a performance, not a reckoning. What I wanted was accountability, paper, numbers, structure, the things I should have insisted on at the beginning. Brendan was quiet. Then he said, "She's not going to like that." I said, "I know." He said, "I'll make sure it happens." I believed him. Not because I had always believed him without reservation. I had learned something about the difference between trust and assumption, but because I heard in his voice the same thing I had felt in my chest on that sidewalk. The weight of a thing you cannot put back the way it was, but that you are willing to carry differently going forward. The agreements were drafted. My lawyer reviewed them. Courtney signed hers without comment in a meeting that Brendan told me later had lasted 4 hours. I was not there. I did not need to be. 3 weeks later, Brendan called to ask if I wanted to come see the Roastery. I drove down on a Saturday morning, the kind of clear January day where the light is thin and very precise, and everything looks like it has been outlined in pencil. I parked on the street in front of the brick building, and I went inside. The smell hit me first. Coffee, yes, but under it something deeper, warm wood and a faint trace of smoke from the roasting drum, and something I can only describe as industry, the particular smell of a place where something real is being made. The room was smaller than it looked through the window, and more personal. The walls had photographs of the farms where the beans came from. There were handwritten cards on the menu board in my son's printing, which is the same block print I use, the same I taught him when he was 7 years old. Brennan came out from behind the bar when he saw me. He hugged me longer than he had in years. He did not say anything, which was right. Some things do not need words. They need presence. He made me a coffee himself. He walked me through every part of the space. He showed me the roasting room and explained the drum and the airflow and the way the beans move through heat. He was lit up the way he gets when he talks about things he loves. The way he was at that kitchen table 3 years ago with his 42-page business plan, and I watched him and I thought about his mother, who would have been so proud it would have embarrassed him. Before I left, he walked me back out through the front room and pointed to the small framed panel beside the entrance. I hadn't noticed it when I came in. It was a simple thing, a small rectangle of dark green that matched the signage, with 4 lines of cream-colored text. The first line was the roastery's name. The second was the year it opened. The third said, "Built with family." The fourth line said, "In memory of Patricia." I stood there for a moment with my hand on the doorframe. I should have done that from the beginning, Brendan said behind me. Yes, I said, you should have. We stood there together for another moment, not speaking, and I thought about what I had learned that I wish I had known before. That money inside a family does not behave like money in a contract. It carries feeling. It carries history. It carries all the things you never said and all the things you assumed were understood. It turns into something other than money, and when it goes wrong, what breaks is not the finances. What breaks is the story you were telling yourself about who the people you love actually are. The thing is, that story can be rewritten. It has to include the truth this time, all of it. The parts that were beautiful, and the parts that were painful, and the parts that you had to put in writing, because you learn that love without structure is just hope, and hope is not a foundation. I am not an easy man to fool twice. But I am still my son's father, and I walked back out into that January light, and I was glad the place existed, and I was glad I had helped build it, and I was glad, finally, to have walked through the door. I keep coming back to the oak tree in my backyard, the one I watched go orange and then bare over the course of those months. There is something about the way a tree loses its leaves that used to bother me when I was younger. All that exposure, all that plainness, now I think it's the most honest thing in nature. You can finally see what's holding everything up. That's what this whole experience did to me. It stripped away what I had assumed was solid and showed me the actual structure underneath. I had made a mistake that I think a lot of parents make, and it has nothing to do with the money. The money was just a place where the mistake became visible. The real mistake was this. I confused love with trust, and I confused trust with assumption. I loved my son completely, and from that love I built a set of assumptions, that he would handle things with the same integrity I tried to model, that the people he chose to share his life with shared his values, that family meant the same thing to everyone at the table. I never tested those assumptions. I just poured $310,000 through them and hoped the structure would hold. It mostly did. That part still matters to me. Brendan is not Courtney, and I had to learn to hold that distinction clearly without letting it collapse into either blind defense of him or wholesale condemnation of everyone involved. That required a kind of clear-eyed thinking I had to work to maintain, especially at 3 in the morning, when the simpler, angrier version of the story was easier to reach for. What I learned is that integrity, real integrity, not the performed kind, doesn't announce itself. It shows up in the small decisions, the ones nobody's watching. Courtney made her small decisions when no one was looking. So did Brendan, when he chose not to ask harder questions because the timing was inconvenient. And so did I, when I waved off the paperwork because I thought love was enough of a foundation. It isn't. Love is the reason you build something. It is not the building itself. I also learned that the willingness to face an uncomfortable truth and then to act on it deliberately, without rage, without collapse, is not something that comes naturally to most people. It has to be developed the way any skill is developed, slowly, through practice, through failure, through choosing the harder response when the easier one is right there. When I drove to that roastery and stood on the sidewalk and made myself look at what I was actually feeling instead of what I wished I was feeling, that was the moment things began to shift. Not because the truth felt good. It didn't. But because I had enough self-respect left to face it. That self-respect, the kind that doesn't require an audience, that holds steady even when you've been genuinely wronged and no one has apologized yet. That is the thing I most want to pass on to my son. Not the money. Not even the business. The capacity to look at hard things without flinching and to do the right thing anyway. Brendan has that in him. I watched it come forward when you read my letter. I'm watching it continue to come forward now in the way he is handling what needs to be handled. That gives me something I didn't expect to still have at 68. Genuine hope, not the soft, unexamined kind I had before all this. The kind that has been tested and held. The roastery is real, the copper drum is turning. My wife's name is on the wall. I walked through the door, and it was enough.